And I'm really pleased to say that Mary Shirley is with us this time. And Mary, you grew up in New Zealand. You worked for a time in the New Zealand government, both with the Privacy Commissioner and the Commerce Commissioner, looking at data protection and privacy violations, and then at antitrust matters. You then went to go and work for Tata in Singapore, and then you had various roles in Dubai and Hong Kong, and you joined Fresenius in Hong Kong, but then moved to their US HQ, and you've been with them for 5 years or so now. So firstly, thanks very much for joining us. And secondly, I guess the immediate question, why a world of compliance?
Yeah, well, first off, Jonathan, thank you so much for inviting me. It's lovely to be here. In respect of your question, if you'd asked me 15 years ago, what is it that you want to do with your life? Never in my wildest imagination would I have said leaving Wellington. So Wellington is a very small place. There's basically 1 degree of separation between everyone there. And it's where I'd grown up. It's what I knew. I'd bought an apartment when I was 24, and that was life, I thought. And then without any kind of planning, I fairly spur of the moment ended up moving to Singapore to work in private practice there initially. And I just could not handle the hours, the lack of having any kind of social life. And so at that point, I asked myself, is this the life that you want? Or should I just take the easy step and go back home to New Zealand and settle right back into that Wellington life that I had? And I decided to see if there were further opportunities available for me that would create a better balance. And I ended up moving in-house to Tata, as you'd mentioned. And from there, it just spurned this huge love of travel, checking out other cultures, meeting different people. And I very initially was a person who you could almost describe as codependent before I'd left New Zealand. I was very shy, very introverted, and I am still very much those things. However, the push to go overseas meant that I was forced to be braver than I perhaps initially thought I was. And once I'd hit Singapore and was exploring all of the Southeast Asian locales around me, that triggered a love and an interest of experiencing workplaces and living in other countries.
And so you've always been a fantastic resource for that cultural understanding, particularly in Asia, but not exclusively, understanding how different compliance initiatives will be understood there. How important is culture in rolling out a global compliance program?
I think it's critical, Jonathan. And one of the things that you really struggle with, you can't help, when you move into a place as a foreigner, you are an outsider, right? Like, you're not part of the in-group. You don't necessarily look like everyone else. You don't sound like everyone else. And sometimes you don't think like everyone else. And so you're actually on the back foot, I think, especially in compliance. And so one of the ways in which you can help narrow that gap is to understand and immerse yourself in the culture of the new place that you've arrived in, partake in the festivities. That first of all is excellent for you socially. It's broadening for your mind. But then from a compliance perspective, it can be of critical importance. And I'll give you a really easy to understand example, which is that in Asian culture, it's very common in many of the countries there to give a sum of cash when you attend a funeral, even if it's in a business setting. Not exclusively, but oftentimes it's presented in a white envelope, which some of you who are familiar with red envelopes, which we would give at Chinese New Year and that are given at weddings, the equivalent is almost for funerals. And if you're not aware of that as a compliance officer and you don't explicitly address this in your compliance program, my anecdotal experience has been that if there is something that is so deeply entrenched and embedded in culture, people assume that it does not apply to the compliance policies, that it's somehow out of scope because this is part of our lives. I understand we've got compliance and we've got policies and we've got guardrails. However, it doesn't apply to my insert cultural celebration here. And so if you don't ask, what is our practice in our company of dealing with funerals when they come up, and we need to somehow acknowledge the passing of a respected business associate, what is it that we do? And how can we talk about how to fit that within our compliance policies while respecting local culture and heritage, as well as remaining within the rules that we have set for ourselves, which in my experience typically do not have a carve out or an exception for those cultural practices.
Yeah, and I think that's very important. And I think we have our own policy at Cordery, for example, which is a very small measure of that. But if you go on a trip, a business trip away, you have to buy a guidebook, you have to do a bit of research on the locale, and you have to build time to an account that enables us to measure it, because of course a lot of lawyers, unless it's build to a particular account, then it's impossible to measure. But I think that repays itself hundreds of times over, just even small things like understanding a bit of the culture and a bit of the sensitivities. And then how is it different having been in a, if you like, a satellite operation, going now to being in HQ? Are there any differences in the way in which you manage compliance in those two different environments?
Yes, so that's an interesting question, Jonathan, and I won't speak from my Fresenius experience, because for the most part I've only ever been in satellite offices, but previously I have worked out of the global headquarters for compliance. So at Tata, Agreco, where I held a compliance role as head of compliance there. Typically you tend to be more focused on the strategy of the compliance program, and you may have less interface with the business. And what I have found every time that I'm in an exclusive sort of strategy only role, the drafting of the policies, planning of the compliance program, and so on, I really miss working with the business. And so I think that's one of the biggest parts. And so for me, the best of both worlds is something that encapsulates both: getting to have a say in terms of the direction on which the compliance program is going, having an understanding as to whether the compliance program could be evaluated as being a robust one, and then equally getting to advise the business, working with them on those tough matters, hearing about a new launch that we want to do or a new acquisition, and then working through that with them. So I think that's probably the key difference. And in my opinion, or in terms of my preferences, I love a role that encapsulates both of those things.
And one thing that I know you're pretty passionate about is the need to look at potential retaliation against whistleblowers. And of course, in many countries, or in some countries, retaliation is unlawful and can possibly be criminalized. But what are the sensitivities there?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest sensitivities for me is when companies only focus on retaliation as part of their Speak Up campaign. That's not to say it's not important. It is. In fact, it's typically found to be the biggest reason why people don't speak up. However, if we focus only on that, then we're missing opportunities in other areas, because fear of retaliation is not the only reason why people don't speak up. And so for me, it's important to think about, how do we address anti-retaliation, but how do we address the other things? And so, for example, recently I did a communications campaign for Speak Up, which not only involved anti-retaliation awareness and education, but also addressing one of the other issues, which is people feel sometimes that speaking up is futile, that I call the compliance action line, if I speak to my manager, it'll essentially go in one ear and out the other. Nothing will be done about it. There's no point. It's a waste of my time. And so for me, that's one of the biggest sensibilities, is just focusing putting all of your eggs in the retaliation basket. And I get that, because it is a common reason. And also it's one of the most egregious reasons. In and of itself, retaliation becomes another compliance issue. It's another substantive issue. So I think that's what's caused people to really focus on it, but to the detriment of having a more holistic outreach.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we've been involved in a couple of projects recently looking at speak out lines, whistleblower lines that have gone wrong. And in a couple of cases, I think have been really interesting on that topic, in that we had one where there was a pattern of people being whistleblowers and then leaving the business. And it turned out they were actually unrelated, or perhaps slightly related, in that people raised an issue, it wasn't dealt with, and they voted with their feet and left. But often it's the perception as well, isn't it? If people perceive that if I raise an issue, I leave the business, they don't see that those people left voluntarily and suspect retaliation has taken place. So obviously, for many organizations, the challenge is, not only to be just in the way in which you handle whistleblower complaints, but be seen to handle things justly and properly as a result.
Absolutely, because as we know, they don't go away. The worries don't go away if we sweep them under the carpet. People are then more likely to go to regulators. We know that. And so armed with that knowledge, we've got to do something about it and think strategically about what are the ways in which we can address those actual concerns and prevent that predictable human behavior from occurring. Obviously, we want to self-report where it would be prudent to do so, but for smaller issues that would not involve us potentially going to a regulator, smaller things we want to be able to deal with in-house. We don't want to air our dirty laundry everywhere as compliance officers. We want to retain the control to discipline and investigate. And as soon as someone leaves the company and, talks about things like sexual harassment, things like that, that could be a huge reputation hit, we lose that control. And if you can manage that by simply creating, for example, more transparency in the process. So for us, and I was inspired by the Hyatt Hotels Code of Conduct, they actually transparently state in their Code of Conduct the steps, what you can expect from an investigation. And so taking the lead from them, or taking a cue, I did an awareness campaign on the same, which showed, if you make a report, this is what happens. So demystifying the very sort of mysterious world of investigations. And of course, they're confidential by nature, but that doesn't mean that you can't share some of the approaches that investigators would take whilst maintaining the confidentiality of individual investigations.
Yeah, good point. So I guess final question, 2020 has been a year that many of us would rather forget, but looking to the future, you've got a book coming out, but more generally, other than the book, what is the future of compliance?
Yeah, so, there is a wacky distant cousin on my father's side of the family who claims that clairvoyancy historically ran on that side of the family. But just in case I take more after my mother, I'll take a more methodical approach to answering this question than what I'm feeling in my waters. So oftentimes, to see what the future holds, we look to the past. And if I were to think back to the last 10 years of what we've been seeing in compliance, we at that time had quite sort of specific subject matter areas that were substantive compliance topics. Anti-corruption, data privacy often fell into compliance programs, antitrust, insider trading, sometimes import-export control, that type of thing. And then as time has progressed, we've taken on more. And so when we think about things like the Modern Slavery Act coming into force in the UK, many compliance programs jumped on that. As we've seen moral reckonings, compliance officers have put their hands up and said, yeah, I'll take that on. Hashtag me too. The latest Inside the Mind of the CCO report by Compliance Week indicates, I think this percentage was 56% of compliance programs have taken on diversity and inclusion. as part of the work that they do, not just putting their hand up as a community member and saying, we want to do something about that, which is what Lisa Fine and I did for Great Women in Compliance, but specifically part of their portfolios. And then I think as well about some of the tools that we've been provided. So looking 10 years ago, I don't think many of us, at least consciously, thought about using data analytics. We didn't think about behavioral economics. And so the compliance world is ever growing, I think. And so when we look to the future, I think we can imagine that it will continue to grow and expand. Not only will we have more tools to work with to help us do our jobs better, but we'll probably have broader subject matter to deal with as well. And so when I think about the moral reckoning, what I'm starting to see a pattern of is that when there are social justice issues, which previously we may not have ever thought would have fallen under compliance, we might have said, oh, that's an HR thing. Now I think we're likely to see trending of compliance departments saying, actually, I think we've got a stake in this. Maybe with HR, we work on this together. So the future of compliance, I think, is ever evolving. And there are things that I can't even imagine that we'll be talking about in 10 years' time.
Yeah, well, let's look forward to that conversation. Let's hopefully speak before then even, Mary. And, and thanks so much for joining us. This has been fascinating. And thank you at home for watching us as well.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It was lovely to be here.